minutes past 9.
The Radio Wammo Breakfast.
Live from the New Scientist Labs, Janine Young, newscientist.com.
Joining us in Melbourne City, Janine Young with the latest in New Science. G'day there, Janine.
Good morning.
And first up this morning, forget about oil. Water into the future is going to be the resource that countries are going to be most competitive about. And there's been an article in the latest New Scientist magazine about this.
You're right. We've talked about virtual water and issues to do with water before now, particularly when it comes to food. Interesting article this week talking about the fact that countries such as, for example, but not exclusively, China and India and Saudi Arabia outsourcing their food growth. For example, between 2004 and 2009, Saudi Arabia bought up 376,000 hectares of land in Sudan to grow wheat and barley. China and India are also very big in Ethiopia. And what they're doing is tapping into water resources that a lot of these developing African nations don't have they don't have the infrastructure to be able to exploit themselves.
Right.
So although it appears to be a dusty, dry, famine-ravaged continent, it's not entirely so. There's actually a fair amount of water there to be exploited if you know how. So what they're doing is saying, right, we don't need to upgrade our own irrigation and water management resources in our own countries, particularly in China and India, and they do have good resources there. They do actually have good infrastructure. They just don't want to update it. And they don't want to use their own resources, so they're tapping into those in Africa. And this creates a few potential problems. At the moment, they're doing all right. They don't have any problems that they're admitting to.
Yeah.
However, the United Nations has pulled together a really interesting model of the virtual water trade, because when you eat something, you actually have virtual water in it, because it takes water to grow things. And if ever you've grown anything in your backyard, you're surprised at precisely how much water it takes to grow carrots or beetroot or lettuce. It takes a lot of water.
Sure.
So this virtual water that's locked up in your food effectively is a trade. And so the UN has pulled together this model that's been looking at their own food and agricultural organisation trade data on, and I'll just pull it together so I've actually got it correct, barley, corn, rice, soya beans, wheat, beef, poultry and pork. So they're covering the gamut of what gets traded across the world. And they've combined that with fairly finely detailed hydrology patterns and maps and other information they have. And they've found that there's about 6,000 countries that are, 6,000 links, that are associated with 166 nations that are involved in these sorts of trading. Interestingly, 5% of the worldwide water flow runs through one link through to the US and Japan. And they're known as the Rich Club. Not surprisingly, I don't think anybody is going to be terribly surprised at knowing this is happening, simply because it just seems to be the way things get exploited across the world. China and India are not as strong. They don't have as many links and they're not as well ingrained into the system, which means that in time they could become much more susceptible to the vagaries of markets. Prices go up and down, things crash. Markets can be very tricky places to be. And they also run into other potential problems in the fact that when you are using someone else's resources, like water, you become a bit lax at home. You know, you go to a hotel and you have a shower and suddenly you're taking up, 15 minutes, where at home you might take 4.
Right.
It's the same sort of principle. So over time, it's very likely this could backfire on them, because their own water resources can become depleted. They could become exposed to the vagaries of the market, and it might not be a long-term strategy. But at the moment, this outsourcing is what they're doing, and they think that this leasing strategy, if you like, is one that is working for them.
But as you say, so this idea of virtual water puts a price signal on not only the cost of the land and the crops, but also the inputs that are going into it as well. One must wonder, though, how this affects local populations while their land is being used to feed an overseas country.
Absolutely. You can only imagine how people feel when they can see these fields and fields of crops And I would imagine, I don't know for certain, but I would imagine they're fenced in. I would imagine they're probably protected. Imagine there's security. I can imagine that that's not going to be a terribly pleasant or stable situation. I don't see a situation where water won't become a major trigger point for conflict in the future, simply because water is critical for everything we do in life. As you say, local communities can't be happy about this, but I'm sure there's nothing that they can do.
Yeah. Right, let's move on to the next story. Bicycles. The bicycle has celebrated 150 years this year. It's been around. It doesn't seem very long, really, when you think about it, I suppose. But I just wonder how far the bicycle can really evolve to become the perfect, vehicle using human power to get around.
Some would argue that it already is. I have a number of friends who ride competitively and they do, road cycling and all, and they think that the bike is the most beautiful thing on the planet. I don't share their enthusiasm, I must confess, but, to each their own. I also haven't come off and busted my knee several times.
Right.
It's a trade. But the thing about bikes is that we think we know how they work, but we don't. In all honesty, physicists and other people interested in bicycles don't understand the physics of how bikes stay up, how they stay stable. There's a process called self-stability, and I think most of us would have tried it. If you push a bike along at the right speed without a rider, it'll stay up on its own.
Yeah.
And most people think, that's to do with the gyroscopic effect. You've got the spinning wheels and that generates angular momentum, and I think most people would think that it's all down to the spinning wheels. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. There's another 6 or 7 particular variables. It can be the geometry of the steering axis, the distance between the wheels, the weight distribution. It can all vary, and at this point, they haven't untangled precisely what is essential to make sure that these bikes stay up. I love these sorts of stories because it just shows that, things can work, like bumblebees, even though we don't actually know how. I think that's quite entertaining. But they do have some mathematical models for how these things work, and they are starting to make some differences. Recumbent bicycles, ones where you lean back and pedal, I've never thought they were stable, but apparently they're really very comfortable to pedal. What's interesting is that if you are taller or shorter, the way that you ride that bicycle and the handling of it is really very different. If you have a longer bike to accommodate a taller person, then that lowers the centre of gravity and vice versa. So if you're short, it needs to be a little bit shorter, and therefore you have a higher centre of gravity. That affects the handling. And so researchers have been looking at and trying to work out ways to change various parts of the bicycle to make it more stable for everyone. Older riders tend, apparently, not to go as fast as bikes are intended to go. So it means that also their vestibular system, so that their balance and the like, is not as good or as solid or as reliable as it could be when you're younger. So what they're looking at doing is changing now the angle of the seat and a whole bunch of other things there, so they think they can actually make bikes better and more stable for older people. But that's about the extent of it. They're not actually at this point able to build a super bike that's radically different from what we have now. Through trial and error, it seems the bike has gotten to a point where it's about as good as it's going to be. Certainly for racing, the trial and error process has done them really rather well, and they have some very fast, very reliable and very lightweight bikes that frankly go very fast.
And I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a general trend for casual bikers just getting around town to actually buy older vintage-looking bikes as opposed to the flash new, lightweight ones that go really fast and all with all the gears and whatnot. People are opting for something that comes out of the 50s.
Well, I guess if you're a casual rider, you don't need all the, for want of a better word, bells and whistles. You don't need all the extra carbon fibre stuff. As I said, I'm not a rider. Forgive me, but all the people who are, I sound like a complete heathen, I'm sure. But I would imagine if you're just riding down to the shops, you don't need all of that.
Yeah.
What you really need is something that's going to get you there that has a reliable set of brakes.
Yeah.
That's probably as good as it gets.
It goes along and you can stop it. I think that's...
Precisely. The other thing is that they don't know how the rider becomes involved with this, because each person is different and there's going to be a subtle interplay. For a long time it was thought that to steer we used our entire upper body. It's actually not. It's mostly that we stay in line with the bike and we turn the handlebars. We don't actually move our body. So they don't even know how the rider interacts with this. It's such a fantastic story. I love this one. We've got no clue.
It's interesting, yeah.
We just can't tangle it.
Well, I know just from riding, a scooter or motorbike that that it's not necessarily though actually steering with your hands. It's kind of leaning. Will make you turn corners, which it must be the same case on bikes as well, especially if you're going quite fast.
I suppose some motorbikes and the like are much heavier too.
Yeah.
So you'd need that extra lean to be able to get it to turn.
Yeah.
Bikes are quite light when you think about it, so perhaps the mechanics are slightly different. But I would imagine that there's got to be some principles that are fairly similar across bikes.
Interesting. Who knew that you could have such a long conversation about the old bicycle?
I never thought I would.
Well, you can find those stories we've just been talking about at New Scientist magazine coming out next week, and also eventually online as well, newscientist.com. Thanks, Janine. We'll talk to you in 2.
Sounds good.